Welcome to Chapter 8, and that is Part 2 of Muscles with Kinesiology 2. Here we're talking about the shape and fiber arrangements of the muscle. Parallel is exactly as it sounds when the muscle fiber runs parallel to each other. And then we have pinnate, which is uni, bi, and multi, where fibers run at angles to the tendon, similar to a feather. So you have uni meaning one, bi, two, and multi more than two. And that would be shown in the first three illustrations here on this page as an example. Okay, so parallel versus pinnate. With parallel, you're going to find that they are longer muscle fibers, but with the longer muscle fibers, they're going to give you a greater range of motion. These do have less strength and usually has two short tendons, where the pinnate, you're going to have a large amount of short fibers. Of course, that does cause less range of motion, but it gives you greater strength. And it runs almost the length of the muscle. So with parallel, you have flat, which are thin and broad, typically like the frontalis. Sphincter, circular fibers that open and close. So we're talking about mouth, eyes, and anus. Fusiform, wide belly with tapered ends, for example, brachialis. Strap, uniform width throughout as the sartorius, and triangular, which are fan-shaped like the pectoralis major. And then as far as pinnate, we have unipinnate, bipinnate, and multipinnate. Here we have a subcategory of parallel muscles, which are flat, and we have the frontalis and the rhomboids. Think of them as sheets or fans. They're designed to cover large areas and provide protection or broad pull rather than pinpoint precision. So with the frontalis, this is a perfect example because it's a thin sheet that lacks a bony attachment at one end. So the rhomboids, while often classified by their geometric shape, they function as a flat muscle that pin the scapula to the rib cage, acting like a broad stabilizing plate. Okay, here we have the sphincter muscles, two of which are the orbicularis oris and the orbicularis oculi. The orbicularis oris is around the mouth, and orbicularis oculi, of course, around the eye. And these are the gatekeepers. So their sphincter muscles are often unique because they don't have a traditional origin and insertion on the bone, and instead they attach to other muscles or skin, allowing them to cinch closed. Think of them as drawstrings. When the fiber contract or shorten, the diameter of the opening gets smaller, just like pulling the strings of a hoodie or a laundry bag. A great way to remember the specific examples is the double O rule. Orbicularis oris and orbicularis oculi are the circular openers and closers. So with ocular, of course, vision, that's a good way. It helps handle squinting and blinking. And then with the orbicularis oculi or oris, let me start that over again. With the orbicularis oris around the mouth, think oral. It's often called the kissing muscle or the pursing muscle. Here we have another example, and it's the fusiform, two of which are the brachialis and the abductor digiti minimi or digiti minimi. And the thing to remember here is that they kind of shape a cigar or a football. The belly is wide to hold more muscle fibers, while the ends narrow down into strong cord-like tendons. So unlike flat or parallel muscles that we just covered, fusiform muscles concentrate all their force into a small specific attachment, and it makes them great for strong, fast movements. These two are shaped on very different scales. So the brachialis is deep to the bicep brachii, and the abductor digiti minimi is on the ulnar side of the hand or the pinky side. So when you palpate the brachialis, I just want you to remember that because it lies under the bicep, or you have to edge the bicep over to fill that thick fusiform belly. So for the abductor digiti minimi, spread your finger wide and feel the lateral side of your hand, and you'll feel that little football shape engage. It's a perfect example how even a tiny muscle follows the same structural rules as big ones. Okay, here we have the strap muscles, and they're exactly what they sound like: long, thin, and uniform in width. And unlike the fusiform muscles that we just discussed, strap muscles look like pieces of nautical rope or a seatbelt. And think of them as measuring tapes. They're designed for maximum length change, which allows a huge range of motion. Because they don't have a bulge, they can tuck into tight spaces or wrap around each other structures without adding too much bulk. So let's talk about the sartorius, which is also called the tailor's ribbon. It's the longest muscle in the body, and it winds across the thigh like a pageant sash, which you can see there. And then we have the rectus abdominis, which are the ladders. And while we see packs, it is usually one long strap divided by tendinous intersections, and that's where you get the lines of the six-pack. Since we want to think about that in ways of palpation, because strap muscles are thin and long, they can be harder to grab than a fusiform muscle. So use your broad-handed approach, and so like a palm or reinforced fingers, and rather than pinching, because that way they don't slide right off of the muscle. So I talk a lot about using wide palm, and that is why. The rectus abdominis, the strap design is what allows us to bend forward so far. So if this were a thick fusiform muscle, the bellies would get in the way of our own movement. So them being the way that they're shaped is how we can bend a little bit easier. Here we have the triangular muscles, and they are affectionately called the fans because they start from a very broad origin and converge toward a single narrow attachment point, or the insertion. So think of them as a hand fan or a megaphone. So because so many fibers are packed into a small attachment point, they're incredibly strong muscles. They allow for versatile movement because different parts of the fan can contract independently to pull in different directions. So of course, the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi, affectionately known as the traps and lats, are two of the largest triangular muscles of the back, and they work like a massive suspension system for the torso. So As we're talking about the trapezius or the traps, that is the origin point is the spine and base of the skull, and that would be where the acromion and the clavicle, and then of course, no, I said that wrong. Sorry, let me restart that. The broad or origin point of the traps is the spine and base of the skull, and then we have the insertion, which is the shoulder, which is the acromion and the clavicle. And so it looks like a shawl over the shoulders, and that's a really good way to remember it, to know exactly how much of that it covers. And then you've got the lats or latissimus dorsi. The origin point is the lower back and pelvis, so the thoracolumbar fascia, and then the insertion is the front of the humerus, so the arm bone. And it looks like a cape that narrows as it tucks under the arm. So just remember with the traps that there's actually 3 muscles in one, the upper, the middle, and the lower. And because these fibers fan out, you have to change direction when you're feeling the stroke of this muscle. And it's depending on what part of the triangle that you're actually working on. That's important to remember there. And then the lats, so there's a twist. So even though the lats are a broad fan on the back, they actually twist as they insert into that arm area. So this spiral helps create that massive pulling power that's needed for climbing or swimming because it makes it stronger. Okay, here we have unipinnate, which is the muscles like the tibialis posterior and the semimembranius, and they're called the half feathers. So the tibialis posterior is deep in your calf, and the semimembranius is one of your hamstrings. These fibers run diagonally into one side of the tendon. And why does this matter? Because diagonal fibers mean we can pack more muscle into a smaller space. These muscles are dense and incredibly strong. So when you're trying to reach the tibialis posterior, remember it's deep and it's tough. It's built to hold up the entire arch of your foot. So when you put your hands on a client, ask yourself, am I feeling a flat sheet, a thick football, a dense feather? Those kind of things can help you figure out exactly how much pressure you need to use and which way to stroke. Okay, moving right along, we're looking at the bipinnate muscles. And if the last ones were one-sided feathers, these are full feathers. Think of a classic quill pen. You have a central tendon running right down the middle, and the muscle fibers angle into it from both sides. So why this design? Bipinnate muscles are the ultimate power builders. By angling the fibers this way, the body can pack a massive amount of pulling power into a narrow space. These muscles don't stretch as far as our strap muscles, but they are very strong. So with the rectus femoris, this is that big, powerful muscle right down the center of your thigh. When you go to kick a soccer ball, this bipinnate feather is what gives you that explosive force. Because the fibers converge from both sides onto that central tendon, it's like having 2 muscles working as one. And then the lumbricals. Now, huge contrast, right? These are tiny muscles in your hands and feet, and even though they are small, they use that same feather design to help perform precise movements, like flexing your fingers while keeping your knuckles straight. So when you're massaging the rectus femoris, you can actually feel that peak in the center where the fibers meet the tendon. If you find that your client has a lot of tension here, remember that you're working on a very dense feather. You often need to work with those diagonal lines to really get the tissue to release. So just remember, bipinnate equals bipower, so twice the power. I hope that helps with that one too. So we've looked at the one-sided feather, the two-sided feather. Now we're looking at the multipennate muscles like the deltoid and the infraspinatus. So I want you to think of this like a bouquet of feathers or a cedar branch. Instead of just one central tendon, you have a tendon that branches out into several stalks, and the muscle fibers wrap around all of them. So why this design? This is the most complex and powerful arrangement in the body because the fibers are coming from so many different angles into those branching tendons. These muscles can generate an incredible amount of force, and they're the heavy lifters of your shoulder joint. So the deltoid, which is the classic multi-pennate muscle, it's like 3 or 4 bipinnate muscles all joined together, and this is why your shoulder is so strong. It has fibers pulling from the front, the side, and the back, and all focusing the energy into that one spot on your arm. So next we have the infraspinatus, and you'll find this one on the back of the scapula. It's part of your rotator cuff, so it uses multi-feather design to rotate your arm, and more importantly, to hold your shoulder joint together when you're carrying something heavy. So when you palpate the deltoid, you'll notice that it feels very grainy or thick compared to a flat muscle like the lat. That's because you're feeling all those different sections of fibers. And because a bipinnate muscle pulls from so many different directions, it's prone to getting trigger points in specific pockets. And you can't just treat the deltoid as one big slab of meat. You have to feel for the specific feather in the bouquet because there's so many different ones, and then which one is holding the tension, and adjust your angle to match those fibers. So when you think multipennate, think of a multi-directional power, and that should help when you're thinking of why does this have so many different ways that it feels in there. This slide is called the ROM contest, and it shows us the trade-off between distance and power. So the top row, which is parallel, they're the speedsters, and it is a parallel muscle. The fibers run in a straight line from one end to the other, and because those fibers are so long, they can shorten in by a huge percentage of their total length. So the result, you get massive range of motion, and as you can see on the slide, this parallel muscle can pull that bone through more than 90 degrees of movement, and it's long like a bungee cord, and it gives you a lot of stretch and a lot of pull distance. So the bottom row, which is the pinnate, it's a powerhouse. And remember when we talk about that feather design, because the fibers are diagonal, and these are much shorter than parallel fibers, and overall, shorter fibers can't contract over a long distance. So the result is you get less range of motion, and notice that on the slide that it can't pull the bone nearly as far. So the trade-off here is the secret. While it loses on distance, it wins on strength, because those fibers are packed in diagonally. There are way more of them working at once, and it's like a heavy-duty hydraulic press versus a long rubber band. So when working on a client, if you see a muscle built for high range of motion like the sartorius, expect it to be flexible. If you see a muscle built for low range of motion but high power like the rectus femoris, expect it to be much denser and capable of holding a lot more tension. So parallel wins for distance, but pinnate wins for brute force. And just to reiterate here, we're showing that for the strength contest, that parallel muscles don't have that brute strength that pinnate muscles have. And then also, I just noticed whoever made these slides, they have spelled parallel wrong, and it should be Parallel, just in case you noticed that. So we know the shapes and we know the range of motion trade-offs. Now, how does a muscle actually know when to move? So it happens through something called a motor unit. So a motor unit is a team. It's made of two parts. That a motor neuron is the brain's messenger or electrical wire coming from your spinal cord. And then we have muscle fibers, and those are the workers. So think of this as a light switch in a big building. In a bathroom, one switch might turn on just one light bulb. That's a small motor unit. It's built for precision, like the muscles that move your eyes or your fingers. But in a warehouse, one giant switch might turn on hundreds of light bulbs all at once. That's a large motor unit. It's built for power, like the muscles in your glutes or your quads. So this slide tells us that muscles contain hundreds to thousands of motor units. When you are massaging a client, you aren't just touching one muscle, you're touching thousands of these tiny little electrical units and circuits. So when a muscle is tight, it's often because the brain is keeping too many of these light switches flipped on to the on position. So our goal as therapists is to provide the sensory input that tells the nervous system it's okay to flip off some of those switches. So just remember the all or none law. When the motor neuron sends a signal, every single fiber in that specific unit contracts 100%. The muscle as a whole doesn't just have one setting. It has thousands of these units working together to decide if you're picking up a feather or a 50-pound dumbbell. So we're going to talk about a couple things again from our last slide, but we've got our motor units, which are our light switches, and we're going to talk about how the brain actually flips those switches to create smooth movement instead of just jerky twitching. So that's called muscle programming. The all or none law, again, remember this, and it's when a motor neuron sends a signal. It's not just a maybe. Every fiber in that specific motor unit fires completely and simultaneously. There's no halfway. It's like a camera shutter. It either clicks or it doesn't. And then we have the motor neuron distribution, the steady hand. It's everything. So if everything is all or none, why don't we just jerk around? And it's because of this, because of distribution. Your motor unit engage in a sequential pattern. So think of it like a relay race. As one unit starts to get tired, then another one kicks in. And this rotation is what produces a steady and controlled contraction, so you can hold a cup of coffee without shaking. And then we have recruitment with wave summation. And this is the volume knob. It's an important part of your clinical process. So, recruitment. Your body is efficient and a bit lazy, so it always engages the smaller motor neurons first. And if you're picking up a pencil, you only need the small ones. And if that pencil turns out to be a 20-pound lead pipe, then your brain recruits the larger, more powerful units to help out. So therefore called recruitment. Wave summation. This is all about the pace. And if the nerve signals fire faster and faster, the muscle fibers don't have time to relax between clicks. So the tension builds up or sums together to create a stronger, smoother pull. When you're working on a client with chronic muscle tension or knots, you're often feeling the result of programming gone wrong. So sometimes because of stress or injury, the nervous system keeps recruiting units that aren't needed. and it's firing signals at a pace that doesn't allow the muscle to relax. As massage therapists, our job is to use touch to reprogram that pace. And we want to encourage the brain to stop the constant recruitment and let those motor units finally flip to the off position. So this slide here is the best way to understand how your nervous system handles weight. And as in the slide, just imagine that you're holding an empty jug under a faucet. And when you first start, that jug is light. And your brain only needs to flip a few of those light switches, those small motor units that we've talked about. And it's easy, efficient, requires very little energy. But as the water fills the jug, the weight grows. And your brain, it stayed with those just small units at first, but your arm would eventually start to drop if that was the case. So to prevent that, the brain starts recruitment. It begins calling on more and more motor units, moving from the small, delicate ones to the more powerful ones. And this is why this is called a safety feature. The body doesn't want to use its big, expensive powerhouses unless it's absolutely called on to do so. So by recruiting in stages, we save energy and we maintain control. So it's like a car shifting gears as it goes up to a steeper hill. Now, why do we care about this in clinic? Think about your clients who have postural strain. If someone is sitting at a desk with forward head posture, their neck muscles are essentially holding that heavy water jug all day long. Their brain is constantly recruiting motor units just to keep their head from falling forward. So eventually, those motor units get exhausted and they stay on for so long that they forget how to turn off. And when you feel that hard ropey tension in a client's upper traps, you're feeling a muscle that has been recruiting for backup for 8 hours straight. And your goal with your hands is to help the body feel safe enough to stop recruiting and let those backup fibers finally take a break. Okay, in the next slides, we'll be going over muscle contraction, fiber types, contraction types, gravitational effect, and reverse action. So we've talked about how the brain recruits motor units, and here we're going to look at what it's recruiting. Not all muscle fibers are created equal, so we have 3 distinct types, and each one has a very different job description. So the first one, the slow fibers, which is type 1, they're the marathoners. They are the long distance runners. They're built for endurance and sustained activity. So these are postural muscles, the ones that hold you upright all day. They don't give you a lot of burst power, but they can go for hours without getting really tired, which is why they're called the marathoners. We have fast fibers, which is type 2A, the high intensity middle ground. And these are a bit larger and produce faster contractions than type 1, but they fatigue much quicker. So these are the 400-meter sprinters. They have strength and speed, but they can only keep it up for a few minutes. So this is what you're using during a high-intensity workout. They're versatile, but they have a fuel tank, and that fuel tank can run out relatively fast. Then we have fast fibers, type 2B. So they're the power lifters, and they're the biggest and most powerful fibers in the human body. They fatigue extremely quickly, and these are what you use when you're struggling to lift your own body weight or move a heavy piece of furniture. Once they fire, they need a long time to recover. And why does this matter when a client is on your table? When you find trigger points or chronic tension, it's often in the type 1 or the slow fibers because they are overworked from poor posture. However, if a client comes in with a sudden pull or a strain from lifting something heavy, they're likely overtaxed from their type 2B fibers. And as therapists, if we're doing deep tissue work, you need to be aware of which personality per se you're talking to. So type 1 fibers respond well to slow, sustained pressure, where type 2 fibers might react or guard if you move too quickly or too aggressively. So when you look at a muscle, ask yourself, is this a marathoner I'm working on or a power lifter? So I don't want you to think of a muscle as just one thing. It's not like the biceps is 100% fast twitch and the soleus is not 100% slow twitch. In reality, every muscle of our body is a blend, which are ratios. So think of a muscle like a smoothie recipe. Every muscle uses a balance of both slow and fast fibers. Your postural muscles, like those in your back, might be slow fiber heavy, so they can stay awake all day long. Your sprinting muscles, like your calves, might be fast fiber heavy for that quick push off. So here's the cool part for your clients. Ratios can be modified based on your activities. The body is incredibly adaptive. So if you start training for a marathon, your intermediate fibers, those type 2As we just talked about, will actually start behaving more like slow twitch endurance fibers. So that's why training is important. It's good to go over this with your clients. And if you switch to heavy powerlifting or boxing, they'll shift towards that explosive, fast twitch side. So examples of this are yoga, and that develops those slow, steady, endurance-based fibers for long, controlled holds. And tennis and boxing requires constant bursts of energy, so training the body to recruit more fast twitch fibers for that instant reaction, which is why it is extremely important to train. So why does this matter for us? When you have a client on your table, their lifestyle is written in their muscles. If you are working on a professional athlete, their muscle tissue is going to feel very different than someone who does yoga. The boxer, they might feel snappier or more reactive because they have a high ratio of fast twitch fibers. So you might notice jerking. The long distance runner, their muscle might feel more leathery or dense because of the high endurance demand. So understanding their lifestyle and asking them on those client intake forms, maybe what their job is or what they're doing, or, as you talk in the beginning, kind of find out how they ended up there. But you can't treat a fast twitch athlete's muscle with the same slow sinking pressure you might use on a slow twitch office worker without potentially causing a guarding response. So remember that. You have to match your technique to the ratio of the person in front of you. Now we're getting into the contraction types. 1, isotonic, which is concentric and eccentric, and then 2, isometric. So we're going to put these terms, concentric and eccentric, into a visual we can actually see. Isotonic means the muscle length is changing while the tension stays the same. So 1, concentric, and that's the lift. So if we look at the top row, our guy here is lifting his pet, and to pull up that weight against gravity, the bicep has to win the tug of war. The muscle length decreases, and it shortens and bunches up to pull the forearm toward the shoulder. And concentric is the go phase. This is where the work of movement happens. So then we have eccentric, which is the lower. So the bottom row, he's putting the pet back down. So if he just turned off his muscles, he dropped the poor thing. So instead, his muscles stay engaged to help control the descent, because we don't want to be dropping the dog or the cat. The muscle length increases, and it's lengthening, though it is still technically contracting to resist gravity. So eccentric is the brake phase, just like the brakes on your car. This phase controls the speed of movement and prevents injury. So when you have a client with tendonitis, it's almost always happening in that eccentric phase. And why is this? Because the muscle is being pulled in two different directions at once. So the brain is telling it to hold on, but gravity is pulling it long. So this creates a lot of tension at the junction where the muscle meets the tendon. So when you're doing your clinicals and you find a sensitive spot right at the end of a muscle belly, ask your client, does this hurt more when you're lifting something or when you're slowly putting it down? And if it's the latter, then you're dealing with eccentric strain. And that should really help you understand that a little bit more. So we talked about the cat lifting or dog lifting and where the muscles are moving and changing length, but what happens when the muscle is working hard and nothing moves? That is an isometric contraction. And as this slide says, there is no change in length and no movement. So think of the word itself, iso, which means same, and metric means length. So the tension is high, but the bones stay exactly where they are. And why does this happen? So we're going to look at the middle illustration of the guy posing in the mirror, and he's flexing his bicep and tricep at the same time. Because those opposite muscles engage simultaneously, they cancel each other out. So one wants to bend the elbow, the other wants to straighten it, and the result is a rock solid arm that doesn't move. So the alligator principle. Create, control, and prevent. This is where it gets interesting for our massage and pathology work. Isometric contractions aren't just for flexing in mirrors, they are for stability. And I want you to look at the guy holding the alligator. He has to use isometric strength to prevent that joint from moving. In the real world, this is how we maintain posture. Your spinal muscles are constantly in an isometric tug of war to prevent you from collapsing forward. So, client fatigue. Have you ever had a client say that their back is exhausted even though they just sit at a desk all day? This is truth. Their muscles are doing heavy lifting isometrically for 8 hours, keeping them upright. And they're more tired as if they had been moving all day long. So when we do resisted range of motion tests later, we'll look at some isometric strength. And if a client has pain when they try to move against your resistance, even if the joint doesn't actually move, you can start to hone in on exactly which muscle is injured. So as part of this, I want you to put your palms together in front of your chest and push them against each other as hard as you can. So your palms against each other as hard as you can. So if you feel that, your chest and arms are rock hard, but nothing is moving. That is isometric strength. And this is the strength that keeps our bodies from falling apart. So we've learned the what and the how, but now we have to look at the where. So as therapists, we don't work in a vacuum. We work in a world with gravity. So depending on how your client is positioned on your table, the exact same movement can require a completely different type of contraction. So one, against gravity, the concentric challenge. So look at the middle image. This person is lying flat and trying to lift their head up. So to do this, the neck flexors like the SCM have to win against gravity. So this is a concentric contraction. The muscles are shortening to pull the head up and away from the floor. So with gravity, the eccentric control. Now the third image, the head is already up and they are lowering it back down to the pillow. Gravity wants to slam that head down, but to prevent a headache, those same neck flexors have to act as brakes. So this is eccentric. The muscles are lengthening under tension to control the descent. So neutral to gravity. Imagine if this person was standing up and just turning their head side to side. Since they aren't lifting up or lowering down against the pull of gravity, the movement is relatively neutral, so it takes much less effort. So why does this matter when you're on the massage table? So talk about table positioning. When your client is supine and gravity is pulling their shoulders and chest open, if you move them to prone, then gravity is pulling their shoulders forward. So the muscles that were relaxed in one position might be fighting you in another. So as far as recommendations, if you ever suggest a stretch or a simple movement for a client to do at home, you have to consider gravity. A neck stretch done standing up feels totally different than one lying down because of the gravitational effect. So I want everyone to slowly lower your chin to your chest and feel the back of your neck. Those muscles are working eccentrically to keep your head from just flopping forward. Now lift your head back up. That's concentric. So gravity is the weight we are always lifting. And as a therapist, once you understand gravity, you'll understand why certain postures are so exhausting for your clients, even when they are just standing still. Okay, so we're about to break the number one rule that you've learned in anatomy. We have always said that when a muscle contracts, the insertion moves toward a stationary origin, correct? Well, as you look at this slide, this is reverse action, where the origin moves toward the insertion. So as far as the chin up and the bottom description or bottom picture here, think about your biceps. Usually when you do a bicep curl, your shoulder, which is the origin, stays still, and your hand, which is the insertion, moves towards you, and that's normal action. But this guy doing the chin up on the slide, his hands are fixed to the bar, so when the biceps contract, the hand can't move. So his body moves towards his hands. The origin at the shoulder is being pulled toward the insertion at the forearm. So open versus closed kinetic chains. This leads us up to how we move through space. So open kinetic chain, this is the most common. The distal, or the part furthest away from your core, like your hand or foot, is free to move. So think of waving your hand or kicking a ball. And closed kinetic chain, this is where the distal end is fixed or pinned against something like the floor or a pull-up bar. And because the end is stuck, the rest of your body has to do the moving. So why does a massage therapist care about this? If you have a client who says it hurts to do a push-up but not lift a dumbbell, they are struggling with a closed kinetic chain. It puts a completely different type of stress on the joints. And the sit-up insight here. So if we look at this person holding the feet for a sit-up, by pinning the feet, so fixing the distal end, we've created a closed chain. This allows the hip flexors to pull the spine towards the knees. So that changes all that there. So in a clinical setting, don't just think about what a muscle does on a chart. Think about what it does for the client when the client's feet are on the floor versus when the client's hands are on a railing. And this is where real life reverse action happens. Okay, we've made it to the final slide in this presentation. So we've spent today talking about a lot, even though maybe this wasn't as long as what some other PowerPoints have been. But we've talked about how muscles should work. Now we need to talk about what you're actually going to find when you get your hands on a client in the lab. So the most important sentence on this slide is, our body adapts to change to create a new normal. It's your body saying it's a master of compensation. And if a client sits slumped over a computer for 40 hours a week, the body doesn't just fight it. It eventually says, okay, I guess this is how we live now, and structurally changes the support to support that position. We're going to look at this man with his rounded shoulders. His pectorals are constantly in a shortened position. And over time, they become tight and lose their ability to stretch back out. Meanwhile, the muscles in his upper back are being pulled into a long position. Even though they are stretched, they aren't relaxed. They are exhausted and weak from trying to pull his shoulders back all day. So as a therapist, you can't just treat the part that hurts. Usually the long, weak back muscles are the ones screaming in pain, but the short, tight chest muscles are actually the cause of that. So when a muscle stays in one position for too long, the fascia, basically you can look at that like the plastic wrap coating. So it's like literally plastic wrap holding us in place, begins to structurally change. And that is where we talk about adhesions. And think of this like a biological glue. The fibers literally start to affix to each other. And this is why your client feels stiff and has a limited range of motion. They aren't just tight, they're physically stuck together. So when you get in the lab, I want you to look for these patterns. Don't just look for knots, look for short muscles and long muscles. And that's where myofascial release, trigger point work, long gliding strokes, those help break up those fascial adhesions. So, this old normal isn't working for us anymore. It's time to let go. That's what you're telling the body. So when you identify these postural adaptations, you stop being someone who just massages shoulders and you start being a therapist who can really change lives.